December 12, 1942. 20 miles west of El Agheila, Libya. Hauptmann Werner Becker of the Afrika Korps 3rd Panzer Division scanned the charred remains of what had been, just 6 hours earlier, a fully operational supply convoy. 23 trucks, carrying ammunition, fuel, and desperately needed medical supplies, now lay shattered across the desert floor, their blackened frames still smoldering in the early dawn light. Scattered around them lay the bodies of 37 German and Italian soldiers, caught in their sleep when the attack came. "Impossible," he muttered, kneeling to examine a peculiar pattern of holes punched through the lead vehicle's engine block. No aircraft could have done this with such precision. Not at night. But the evidence was undeniable. The attack had come from the air, under cover of complete darkness, swift, deadly, and with devastating accuracy. Shell casings from .50 caliber machine guns littered the ground. And there, half buried in the sand, he found a fragment of an American-made bomb casing. "So, the reports are true," Becker wrote later that evening in his field journal. "The Americans have found a way to attack effectively at night. If they can strike this deep behind our lines in darkness, nowhere is safe. These are not the awkward, vulnerable bombers our intelligence described to us." What Hauptmann Becker had witnessed was the handiwork of the Douglas A-20 Havoc, an aircraft the German High Command had initially dismissed as a mediocre light bomber of limited threat. That miscalculation would prove costly as the North African campaign unfolded. The A-20's journey to that fateful night had begun years earlier, in the mid-1930s, as the clouds of war gathered over Europe. Douglas Aircraft Company engineer Ed Heinemann had designed the DB-7 prototype as a private venture, hoping to secure military contracts as rearmament accelerated worldwide. When first introduced, the aircraft seemed unremarkable, neither the fastest, nor the most heavily armed, nor carrying the largest bomb load. France placed the first significant order in 1939, with more than 100 aircraft delivered before the fall of France in 1940. Many of these were subsequently captured by the Germans, who found the aircraft unimpressive compared to their own twin-engine designs. A curious little bomber. Luftwaffe General Adolf Galland reportedly commented after inspecting a captured example. "Fast but fragile. No match for our defenses. And with a bomb load too small to cause significant damage. Not a serious threat." This dismissive attitude reflected wider German perception of American aircraft production. Technically unsophisticated, mass-produced machines that would fall short against German engineering excellence. It was an assessment that would prove catastrophically wrong. When the United States entered the war in December 1941, the Army Air Forces had only 168 A-20s in service. By comparison, Germany had over 1,000 twin-engine bombers operational across Europe and North Africa. The numerical disadvantage seemed overwhelming. But behind this apparent imbalance lay America's awakening industrial might. While German aircraft factories struggled under increasingly heavy bombing and critical material shortages, Douglas Aircraft's 3 massive plants in California and Oklahoma began to hit their stride. Production lines operated 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Women joined the workforce by the thousands, taking positions previously held only by men. The results were staggering. By mid-1942, a new A-20 was rolling off the assembly line every 5 hours. "We were producing more A-20s in a month than the Germans were producing all types of twin-engine aircraft combined," recalled James H. Dutch Kindleberger, president of North American Aviation. It wasn't just about quality anymore. It was about overwhelming quantity. The A-20 underwent continuous refinement, with the A-20G variant introducing a solid nose housing 6 forward-firing .50 caliber machine guns, transforming the bomber into a devastating ground attack platform. This particular configuration would prove especially lethal against convoys, airfields, and troop concentrations, capable of delivering 600 rounds per second in a concentrated pattern that could tear through vehicles, aircraft, and personnel with devastating effect. As 1942 progressed, the balance of air power began to shift decisively. German commanders, fixated on the threat posed by heavy bombers, failed to appreciate the growing danger represented by the humble A-20. They were about to receive a rude awakening. Planning and Expectations, October 25, 1942. Mediterranean Allied Air Force Headquarters, Cairo, Egypt. Colonel Delmar T. Wilson, commanding officer of the 47th Bombardment Group, leaned over the large operations map spread across the conference table. Around him stood his squadron commanders, their faces illuminated by the harsh overhead lights. Outside, the distinctive silhouettes of A-20 Havocs stood on the airfield, their maintenance crews working through the night to prepare them for the coming operation. "Gentlemen," Wilson began, his finger tracing the coastal road running west from Benghazi. "Rommel's forces are retreating, but they're still dangerous. Our intelligence indicates major supply convoys moving along this route nightly. They're moving only after dark to avoid our daytime air attacks. This is where we'll hit them." Captain Harold Turner, commander of the 86th Bombardment Squadron, looked skeptical. "Night attacks, sir? The brass has always told us that's too dangerous in A-20s. We don't have the radar or navigation equipment of the heavy bomber groups." Wilson nodded. "That's the conventional wisdom, Captain, and that's precisely why the Germans won't be expecting us. They believe we can't operate effectively at night. We're going to prove them wrong." The plan was audacious. Traditional doctrine held that light bombers like the A-20 were daylight weapons, too difficult to fly in formation at night, and lacking the sophisticated bombing equipment needed for accuracy in darkness. High Command had initially rejected Wilson's proposal for dedicated night attacks, considering it too risky with unacceptable potential for losses. What changed their minds was a demonstration Wilson arranged for Air Force Commander Lieutenant General Carl Spaatz. Using a modified approach with aircraft flying staggered patterns at different altitudes and employing specially trained navigators using dead reckoning and visual recognition of coastline features, Wilson's group demonstrated they could hit targets at night with surprising accuracy. "Give me 3 weeks to train specifically for night operations," Wilson had told Spaatz, "and I'll cut Rommel's supply line to ribbons." Spaatz, impressed by the demonstration and desperately seeking ways to accelerate the North African campaign, gave his approval. But he added a warning. "If your loss rates exceed 15%, I'm shutting it down immediately. I won't waste aircraft and crews on a failed experiment." The planning proceeded with intensity over the following weeks. Navigation was the greatest challenge. The A-20 lacked radar or other electronic navigation aids. Instead, Wilson's teams developed a system using the Mediterranean coastline as a reference, flying at specific altitudes to maintain visibility of both the shore and the coastal road where German convoys traveled. Phosphorescent panels were installed in the aircraft to prevent mid-air collisions without revealing their position to ground observers. For weapons configuration, Wilson made a controversial choice. Rather than the standard mix of bombs, he ordered his aircraft equipped with parachute flares, fragmentation bombs, and incendiary clusters. Most significantly, he insisted on the solid-nose A-20G variant with its 6 forward-firing 50-caliber machine guns. "The bombs will damage and disorient," he explained to his squadron leaders, "but it's the strafing runs that will destroy the convoys. Once the lead and rear vehicles are disabled, the entire convoy is trapped. Then we circle back and attack at will." German intelligence was aware of the American buildup, but misinterpreted its purpose. Intercepted communications suggested the Americans were planning increased daylight bombing of port facilities, not night attacks on mobile convoys. Luftwaffe Commander Field Marshal Albert Kesselring actually reduced night fighter coverage along the coastal roads, redeploying aircraft to defend fixed installations. The Americans lack both the equipment and the training for effective night operations with light bombers, Kesselring wrote in a memorandum dated October 30th. Their A-20 is a fragile aircraft, unsuited to the rigors of night flying in combat conditions. We expect continued daylight harassment, but consider the night hours secure for transport operations. This assessment was shared by Erwin Rommel, whose logistics staff scheduled critical fuel and ammunition movements exclusively during darkness. The British attack at night with Wellingtons, but these are properly equipped for such operations, Rommel noted in his war diary. The American light bombers remain a daylight threat only. Meanwhile, the American mechanics worked feverishly to prepare the aircraft. Special care was given to engine maintenance, as the A-20's twin Pratt & Whitney R2800 engines would be operating at maximum stress during the low-altitude night operations. Extra armor plating was installed to protect pilots from ground fire, and additional radio equipment was fitted to improve coordination between aircraft. "We're creating a whole new role for this aircraft," Master Sergeant Frank Lombardi told his maintenance crew. "These aren't bombers anymore, they're night hunters." By November 7th, Wilson had 67 modified A-20s ready for operations, divided into 3 squadrons. The aircrews had completed over 200 hours of night training flights, and navigators had memorized every detail of the coastal topography from Alexandria to Tripoli. Intelligence officers had compiled detailed information on German convoy patterns, timing, and composition. The stage was set for an operation that would transform perceptions of both the A-20 and American air power capabilities. The hunters were ready, and their unsuspecting prey continued to move along the darkened coastal roads, believing themselves safe under the cover of night. Intelligence and Preparations. November 9th, 1942. Intelligence Section. Axis Supply Command. Benghazi, Libya. Major Heinrich Volkmann studied the aerial reconnaissance photographs spread before him, focusing on the American airfields around Tobruk. The images, taken by a high-altitude Ju-86 reconnaissance aircraft just 24 hours earlier, showed dozens of twin-engine aircraft parked in dispersal areas. A-20s, he noted to his aide, Oberleutnant Kurt Weber. At least 60 of them. But notice, no new revetments for protection, no significant increase in anti-aircraft emplacements. They're not expecting our attention. Weber nodded. Our agents report increased activity, but nothing to suggest a major offensive capability. The Americans are still integrating these units after their arrival from England. Maintenance logs we've intercepted show numerous mechanical issues. These aircraft were not designed for desert operations. What neither officer recognized was the deliberate deception being practiced by the Americans. Colonel Wilson had instructed his ground crews to perform routine maintenance in full view of potential observation, while the critical night attack modifications were done inside hangars or at night under blackout conditions. Several aircraft were left partially disassembled during daylight hours, creating the impression of significant maintenance problems. Simultaneously, American intelligence was gathering crucial information about Axis supply movements. Captain David Morris, an intelligence officer attached to the 47th Bombardment Group, had cultivated a network of Bedouin informants who traveled freely across the desert. These sources provided detailed reports on convoy timings, routes, and composition. "The Germans are creatures of habit," Morris briefed Wilson, They're running their major supply convoys between 0100 and 0400 hours, when they believe they're safe from air attack. Each convoy typically consists of 20 to 30 vehicles, with fuel trucks in the middle protected by transport vehicles carrying infantry on either end. Most critically, Morris had obtained information about the convoy routes. They're staying close to the coastal road, but when they hear aircraft, they pull off onto prepared positions about 50 yards from the roadway and douse all lights. They believe this makes them virtually invisible at night. This insight led to a critical tactical innovation. Rather than attempting to spot the convoys from standard bombing altitudes, Wilson decided his aircraft would fly dangerously low, between 500 and 1,000 feet, using the contrast between the light-colored vehicles and the darker desert floor to locate their targets, even when stationary and unlit. Wilson's preparations extended to crew selection as well. Rather than using all available pilots, he hand-picked crews with superior night vision and demonstrated aptitude for low-level flying. Each selected pilot underwent rigorous testing, including eye examinations and psychological assessments, to ensure they could handle the extreme stress of night combat operations. For the A-20 aircraft themselves, the maintenance crews made several unofficial modifications beyond the official specifications. Exhaust flame dampeners were installed to reduce visible signatures at night. Engine cowlings were painted with a special non-reflective black paint to minimize moonlight reflection. Most importantly, the forward-firing guns were harmonized to converge at exactly 200 yards, the planned attack distance for strafing runs. "Our pilots will have one chance to get it right," Wilson explained to his squadron commanders. "At 300 miles per hour, they'll have less than 2 seconds of firing time on each pass. Every bullet has to count." On the German side, complacency continued to reign. The Luftwaffe's night fighter units in North Africa had been depleted to reinforce the defense of Germany against RAF Bomber Command's increasingly destructive raids. Just 7 Bf 110 night fighters remained operational in the entire North African theater, and these were primarily tasked with defending fixed installations like ports and airfields. Rommel himself, focused on managing his retreat while preserving his combat power, delegated convoy protection to his logistics officers. These officers, trained to maximize efficiency rather than security, created predictable patterns that made their movements vulnerable. "The Americans have never demonstrated any capacity for effective night interdiction," noted a German intelligence assessment dated November 10th. "Their light bombers lack the equipment, and their crews lack the training. The threat remains acceptable." As final preparations for the operation continued, Wilson gathered his squadron commanders for one last briefing on the evening of November 11th. The first mission was scheduled for the following night. Targeting a major fuel convoy, intelligence indicated would be moving westward from Benghazi. "Gentlemen, tomorrow we change the rules of this air war," Wilson told them. "The Germans believe they own the night. By this time tomorrow, they'll know differently. Every convoy we destroy means enemy tanks that won't reach the front. Every fuel truck we burn means enemy aircraft grounded for lack of fuel." Captain Richard Haviland of the 97th Bombardment Squadron raised a concern. "Sir, once we start this, the Germans will adapt. They'll increase night fighter patrols, add more anti-aircraft guns to the convoys. Our advantage of surprise won't last." Wilson nodded grimly. "You're right, Captain. That's why we need to hit them hard and hit them repeatedly before they can adjust. Our first week may be our most effective. Make it count." As the meeting concluded, Wilson shared one final thought. "The Germans think the A-20 is a second-rate aircraft. Let's show them just how wrong they are." That night, ground crews performed final checks on the aircraft selected for the first mission. Bombs were loaded, guns were cleaned and loaded, and extra ammunition was stowed. Pilots tried to rest, knowing that within 24 hours they would be flying into combat under conditions few American airmen had ever experienced. Across the lines, German and Italian convoy drivers prepared for what they expected to be another routine night movement. They checked their blackout equipment, reviewed their emergency dispersal procedures for daylight hours, and plotted their routes on maps. None suspected that the rules of war were about to be rewritten, or that the humble A-20 Havoc was about to transform from an underestimated light bomber to one of the most feared aircraft in the North African theater. Opening actions, November 12, 1942. 47th Bombardment Group Airfield near Tobruk, Libya. 10 minutes before midnight, the first A-20's engines roared to life, breaking the desert silence. Across the airfield, 15 other aircraft followed suit, their propellers catching the dim moonlight as they began to turn. Inside the lead aircraft, pilot Captain James Mahoney ran through his final checklist, his face illuminated only by the dim red glow of the instrument panel. "All crew, sound off," Mahoney called through the intercom. "Navigator ready," replied Lieutenant Thomas Decker from his position behind the pilot. "Gunner ready," came the voice of Staff Sergeant William Collins from the rear position. The 16 aircraft of the 86th Bombardment Squadron taxied into position, their engines at minimum power to reduce dust kick-up. Ground crew guided them with hooded flashlights, invisible from above. At precisely midnight, Mahoney advanced his throttles and began his takeoff roll, the A-20 accelerating rapidly down the dirt runway. Within 30 seconds, all 16 aircraft were airborne, climbing steadily into the clear desert night. Rather than forming up in conventional formation, the A-20s maintained 1,000 yards separation, each aircraft responsible for its own navigation. They climbed to 3,000 feet and turned westward, following the coastline. Radio silence was absolute. Another departure from standard procedure. 110 miles to the west, a German convoy of 27 vehicles had departed Benghazi 2 hours earlier. It consisted of 14 fuel tankers, 8 ammunition trucks, 3 infantry transports, and 2 flak vehicles equipped with 2-centimeter anti-aircraft guns. The convoy commander, Lieutenant Karl Schmidt, maintained a steady 20 miles per hour, keeping his vehicles spaced 50 yards apart to minimize damage in case of attack. At 1:15 in the morning, Schmidt's radio operator received a routine communication from command. "Bussard Convoy, report status." "Proceeding as planned," Schmidt replied. "No enemy activity. Estimated arrival at waypoint Delta 0330. 15 minutes later, lookouts reported a faint engine sound from the east. Following standard procedure, Schmidt ordered the convoy to pull off the road into prepared positions and douse all lights. Within 3 minutes, all 27 vehicles were stationary and dark. "Probably just a high reconnaissance flight," Schmidt reassured his driver. "They won't see us now." 6 miles east and 4,000 feet above, Navigator Decker spotted the convoy through his binoculars. "Target sighted," he reported to Mahoney. "Just as intelligence said. They've pulled off the road, about 50 yards south of the highway. I count approximately 25 vehicles." "Beginning attack profile," Mahoney responded, pushing the yoke forward. The A-20 nosed over, beginning a shallow descent that would bring it to 1,000 feet over the target area. He switched on the bomb release system and armed the forward-firing guns. What happened next would forever change German perceptions of night security. At precisely 1:35, the first parachute flares bloomed above the convoy, bathing the desert floor in harsh white light and casting stark shadows that made the vehicles stand out in sharp relief against the sand. Schmidt and his men, temporarily blinded by the sudden illumination, scrambled for their defensive positions. Before they could react, the first A-20 screamed overhead at just 500 feet, its 650 caliber machine guns hammering the lead vehicle. Streams of tracer fire stitched across the convoy, puncturing fuel tanks and igniting ammunition. The German flak guns opened fire, but their gunners, dazzled by the flares, fired wildly into the night sky. "My God," Schmidt later recorded in his after-action report. The aircraft seemed to appear from nowhere, already firing. The lead vehicle exploded instantly, blocking the road northward. Before we could respond effectively, another aircraft attacked from the opposite direction, destroying our rear vehicles. We were trapped. In the air, Mahoney banked steeply and began a second approach. "Hit the fuel tankers in the middle," he ordered his squadron over the radio, breaking silence now that surprise was lost. "Don't waste ammunition on vehicles already burning." For 22 minutes, the A-20s attacked relentlessly. Each aircraft made multiple passes, striking from different directions to confuse the German gunners. Some dropped fragmentation bombs that shredded vehicles and personnel caught in the open. Others focused on precision strafing runs, their massed forward-firing guns capable of penetrating even the armored fuel tankers. By 1:57, 23 of the 27 vehicles were destroyed or burning. The remaining 4, including one flak wagon, had managed to seek shelter beneath an overhanging ridge. Schmidt, wounded in the arm by shrapnel, watched in disbelief as his entire convoy was systematically demolished. They knew exactly where to find us and exactly how to attack. He later testified during debriefing. These were not random bombs dropped from high altitude. This was precision attack at low level, at night, with a coordination we did not believe the Americans capable of. As suddenly as it had begun, the attack ended. The A-20s, having expended their ammunition and bombs, turned eastward and disappeared into the night. Maney led his squadron back along the coast, maintaining their loose formation. Behind them, the burning convoy served as a beacon visible for miles across the desert, a signal to both sides that the rules had changed. The 16 aircraft returned to base by 3:15, all having survived without serious damage. As they taxied to their dispersal positions, ground crews noted the dust and small-caliber bullet holes in several aircraft, evidence of the light anti-aircraft fire they had encountered. Colonel Wilson was waiting as Mahoney climbed down from his aircraft. "Results?" he asked simply. 20-plus vehicles destroyed, sir," Mahoney reported, his face streaked with sweat despite the cool night air. "Minimal opposition. No aircraft lost." Wilson nodded, hiding his elation behind a professional demeanor. "Refuel and rearm immediately. I want another squadron ready to launch by 0400. There's another convoy reported moving east from Sirte." As the maintenance crews swarmed over the aircraft, the intelligence officers debriefed each crew, marking confirmed kills on their maps and noting German defensive responses. By dawn, it was clear the night's operation had exceeded all expectations. The second attack, launched at 4:20 that morning, found another convoy near Sirte and destroyed 17 vehicles, including several loaded with tank parts and aircraft engines. Again, all attacking aircraft returned safely. By noon the following day, reconnaissance aircraft confirmed both convoy sites still burning, with no evidence of German salvage operations having yet begun. More significantly, radio intercepts revealed chaos in the German command structure, with urgent requests for air cover and confusion about how to respond to the unexpected threat. They're completely disoriented. Captain Morris reported to Wilson after analyzing the intercepts. "The Germans are requesting night fighters from Sicily, but there aren't any to spare from the defense of Italy. They're ordering convoys to move only in daylight, which puts them at risk from our conventional air attacks. Wilson allowed himself a brief smile. We've just eliminated their safe period for movement. Now they have no good options. Day or night, their supply lines are under threat. The success of the first night's operations led to immediate expansion of the program. Within 48 hours, all 3 squadrons of the 47th Bombardment Group were conducting night attacks. Within a week, the 310th Bombardment Group had also converted to the night attack role, doubling the number of A-20s available for convoy interdiction. The humble A-20, once dismissed as unremarkable, had found its lethal purpose in the night skies over Libya. For German forces already struggling with supply shortages, the darkness no longer offered sanctuary. The hunter had become the hunted. The critical moment, December 7, 1942. Command Headquarters, Desert Air Force, Cairo, Egypt. Air Vice Marshal Arthur Coningham studied the large operations map where colored pins tracked the movement of supplies to Rommel's retreating forces. Over the past 3 weeks, a dramatic change had occurred. The steady flow of red pins marking successful German supply movements had dwindled to a trickle. "Remarkable," he said, turning to Colonel Wilson, who stood at attention nearby. "In just 21 days, your A-20s have destroyed 184 confirmed vehicles. Intelligence estimates fuel deliveries to Rommel's forward units are down 63%. The numbers told only part of the story. What made the A-20 night operations truly transformative was how they had systematically dismantled the German logistics model. Faced with effective night interdiction for the first time, the Afrika Korps had been forced to attempt daylight movement of supplies, exposing them to the full weight of Allied tactical air power. "It's not just the direct destruction, sir," Wilson explained. "The Germans are now using 3 times as many vehicles to move the same amount of supplies. They break convoys into smaller groups, take circuitous routes, and maintain huge spacing between vehicles. Efficiency has collapsed." The transformation had come at a pivotal moment in the Desert Campaign. Rommel's forces, retreating westward after their defeat at El Alamein, depended entirely on mobile supply lines. Without regular fuel deliveries, their tanks and transport vehicles became immobile, easy targets for advancing Allied ground forces. Every gallon of fuel that didn't reach the front meant another mile the Germans couldn't retreat in good order. That night, at a German command post 30 miles west of El Agheila, a similar assessment was taking place, though with drastically different emotional overtones. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the famed Desert Fox, examined the latest logistics reports with growing alarm. "These night attacks are bleeding us dry," he told his staff officers, his voice hoarse with fatigue. "The British, we understood. They attack methodically, predictably. But these Americans, they've changed everything with these A-20 operations." Hauptmann Werner Becker, who had witnessed the aftermath of one of the first A-20 attacks, presented his analysis. "Herr Field Marshal, in the past 3 weeks we've lost 42% of our fuel transport capacity. The A-20 has proven far more effective than we anticipated. Its speed makes it almost impossible for our anti-aircraft gunners to track at night. And its 6 forward-facing machine guns have devastating effect in a single pass." What made the situation particularly galling was that German intelligence had specifically discounted the A-20 threat. The aircraft had been assessed as a second-tier design, lacking the sophistication of German twin-engine bombers. This fundamental miscalculation had led to inadequate defensive preparations and a dangerous complacency. "We dismissed it because it wasn't exceptional in any single category," admitted Luftwaffe Major Karl-Heinz Lessmann. "Not the fastest, not the most heavily armed, not the longest range. What we failed to recognize was its balance of capabilities and its suitability for this specific mission profile. The Americans found the perfect application for an aircraft we considered mediocre. The critical moment came on December 8th, when Rommel made a fateful decision. With fuel reserves dwindling and night movement effectively paralyzed by A-20 attacks, he ordered a dramatic acceleration of his retreat. Combat units that could have formed an effective defensive line at El Agheila were instead forced to withdraw all the way to Tunisia, a fighting retreat of over 400 miles. The A-20 has accomplished what direct combat could not, noted British General Bernard Montgomery in his diary. It has forced Rommel to abandon his preferred defensive positions before we even engaged him there. This is not merely tactical success, it is strategic transformation. In the air, the nature of combat was changing as well. After the initial shock, the Germans attempted to adapt by adding more anti-aircraft weapons to convoys and dispatching the few available night fighters to patrol likely routes. But the A-20 crews adapted faster, flying at irregular intervals, using different approach patterns, and attacking from varying altitudes. It became a deadly game of innovation, recalled Lieutenant James Hennessy, an A-20 pilot with the 86th Squadron. The Germans would adjust their defenses, and we would find new ways to defeat them. They began clustering vehicles in tight defensive circles, so we developed skip bombing techniques, bouncing bombs into these concentrations. They tried using searchlights, so we attacked from the direction of the moon, making their illumination work against them. The technical capabilities of the A-20 proved surprisingly well suited for this evolving battle. Its twin engines provided redundancy that saved numerous crews when one engine was damaged by ground fire. Its remarkable maneuverability for a twin-engine aircraft allowed pilots to execute tight turns and rapid altitude changes that kept German gunners disoriented. Most importantly, its rugged construction absorbed punishment that would have downed more delicate aircraft. Captain Richard Haviland described one particularly harrowing mission. "I took heavy flak damage to my right wing and engine over a convoy near Misrata. Half my control surfaces were shredded, and the engine was streaming oil. But the A-20 just kept flying. I made it 200 miles back to base on one engine, with holes you could put your fist through in the fuselage. The ground crews counted 117 separate bullet and shrapnel impacts. No other aircraft in our inventory could have survived that." By mid-December, the impact of the A-20 operations had reached crisis proportions for Axis forces. German records captured after the war revealed that between November 12th and December 15th, night attacks by A-20s had destroyed or damaged 184 fuel transport vehicles, 97 ammunition carriers, 36 personnel transports, 22 artillery pieces being relocated, 17 mobile repair facilities, 3 field headquarters installations. The statistics represented more than equipment losses. They reflected the complete disruption of the German military machine in North Africa. A force designed around mobility and rapid response had been paralyzed by the systematic destruction of its logistical backbone. The Americans have achieved with 60 A-20s what would have required hundreds of conventional bombers, Rommel wrote to the German High Command on December 18th. They have rendered night movement suicidal and day movement impossible. I cannot maintain an effective fighting force without secure supply lines. The critical moment had arrived and passed. What German commanders had once dismissed as an unremarkable aircraft had rewritten the rules of desert warfare. The A-20 Havoc, through innovative tactics and relentless application, had demonstrated that American air power was not merely about overwhelming numbers, but about finding the perfect application for each weapon system. As 1942 drew to a close, the transformation was complete. The hunter had indeed become the hunted, and the darkness that had once sheltered German operations now belonged to the American night intruders and their surprisingly lethal A-20 Havocs. Immediate aftermath and perspective. January 16, 1943. Allied Forces Headquarters, Algiers, Algeria. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, newly appointed commander of all Allied forces in North Africa, studied the aerial reconnaissance photographs spread across his desk. They showed the remnants of what had once been Rommel's vaunted Africa Corps, now struggling to establish defensive positions in Tunisia. "Remarkable what Wilson's A-20s have accomplished," he commented to Air Marshal Arthur Tedder. "The Germans never recovered from having their supply lines cut." The immediate aftermath of the A-20 night operations had been a cascading series of German setbacks. Without adequate fuel, ammunition, and supplies, Rommel's forces had been unable to establish effective defensive positions at successive fallback points. What might have been an orderly fighting withdrawal became increasingly chaotic as supply shortages worsened. By early January 1943, the transformation of battlefield dynamics was complete. Allied forces advancing westward from Egypt and eastward from Algeria had squeezed the remaining Axis forces into an ever-shrinking pocket in Tunisia. The final collapse was now inevitable, though bitter fighting would continue for several months. For the men who flew the A-20s, the perspective was more immediate and personal. Captain David Harris, a pilot with the 97th Bombardment Squadron, recorded his impressions in a letter home dated January 3rd. "We've been flying every night the weather permits, sometimes 2 missions per night. The aircraft are holding up remarkably well under punishment that would break lesser machines. Our ground crews perform miracles, patching holes and replacing engines with astonishing speed. Last week, my A-20 took a direct hit from a 20mm shell that passed completely through the right wing without exploding. The crew chief had it repaired and ready to fly again in 17 hours. Try doing that with a B-17. The German perspective was captured in the diary of Major Heinrich Volkmann, the intelligence officer who had initially dismissed the A-20 threat. "We made a fundamental error in our assessment of American capabilities. We judged their aircraft by our own standards and found them wanting in sophistication. What we failed to understand was that they were building aircraft suited perfectly to mass production and specific tactical roles. The A-20 is not an engineering marvel like our Junkers 88, but it is devastatingly effective in its assigned role, available in overwhelming numbers, and can be maintained in primitive conditions. This is a different kind of excellence than we are accustomed to measuring." For the air crews, the experience of night combat created intense bonds. Navigator Lieutenant Thomas Decker described the unique atmosphere. "Night attack is different from anything else in air combat. You're alone in the darkness, often flying by instinct as much as instruments. There's a strange intimacy to it, just you, your crew, and the enemy below, all wrapped in darkness. When we attack, it's sudden violence punctuating hours of tense silence. Then back into the black void, hoping you've remembered the way home correctly." See, the physical and mental strain was immense. Crews typically flew every other night, with missions lasting 5 to 7 hours. Unlike daylight operations where dozens of aircraft operated together, night missions put enormous responsibility on each individual crew. A navigation error could mean missing the target completely, or worse, flying into high terrain. Staff Sergeant William Collins, a gunner who flew 32 night missions, later recalled, "The hardest part was the return flight. After the adrenaline of the attack, you'd have hours of darkness to get through before reaching base. Every strange sound from the engines set your nerves on edge. Men would sometimes land with their hands frozen to their guns, unable to relax their grip. Tedder, German convoy drivers developed a particular dread of the A-20, nicknaming it Der Schwarze Tod, the Black Death. Survivor accounts describe the psychological impact of knowing that death could come without warning from the night sky. Some refused to drive at night, even under direct orders, preferring court-martial to what they considered certain death. Oberleutnant Kurt Weber, who survived an A-20 attack on January 7th, wrote, "You hear nothing until they are directly overhead. The first indication is often the parachute flares, turning night to harsh white day. By then, it is already too late. The aircraft seem to materialize from nowhere, guns blazing. Men who have faced artillery bombardment without flinching break under these attacks. It is the combination of surprise, noise, and the inability to effectively fight back that destroys morale." Allied intelligence carefully monitored the impact of the operations, not just in material destruction, but in changing enemy behavior. Captain Morris, the intelligence officer who had helped plan the initial attacks, noted in a February report, "Intercepted communications show the Germans now fear night movement more than daylight. They have been forced to adopt inefficient, fuel-wasting convoy procedures. Vehicles now move with 500-yard spacing, requiring 3 times as many drivers to move the same amount of material. Security detachments have been doubled, diverting combat troops to guard duty. Most significantly, they have lost all temporal flexibility. Their operations are now constrained by our air coverage rather than their own preferences." By March 1943, the A-20 night operations had expanded beyond the original North African theater. Similar tactics were adopted in Sicily, Italy, and eventually France. The aircraft's versatility allowed it to adapt to changing conditions and requirements across multiple theaters. In perhaps the most telling acknowledgement of the A-20's impact, the Germans themselves attempted to create their own version of the night intruder force, using captured A-20s supplemented by modified Ju-88s. But they lacked the trained pilots, the maintenance capacity, and most critically, the industrial base to match the American effort. The final validation came from an unexpected source. In late February, the German aircraft manufacturer Messerschmitt circulated a confidential analysis to Luftwaffe commanders, examining Allied aircraft designs. The previously dismissed A-20 received a dramatically revised assessment. The Douglas A-20 represents the perfect balance of industrial practicality and tactical effectiveness. Its design emphasizes ease of production and maintenance without sacrificing essential performance capabilities. This philosophy, rather than pursuit of theoretical technical superiority, may represent the future of aerial warfare. In sufficient numbers, adequately performing aircraft will overcome technically superior but numerically inferior opponents. For the men who flew and maintained the A-20, such validation was unnecessary. They had already witnessed firsthand how an underestimated aircraft, in the hands of determined crews using innovative tactics, had helped turn the tide of war in North Africa. Strategic consequences. March 21, 1943. Office of the Chief of Army Air Forces, Pentagon, Washington, D.C. General Henry Hap Arnold, Commanding General of the United States Army Air Forces, circulated a memorandum to all combat air commands that would fundamentally reshape American air doctrine. The successes achieved by A-20 operations in North Africa demonstrate the critical importance of specialized tactical applications rather than generalized employment of air assets. All theater commanders are directed to evaluate their aircraft in terms of specific mission suitability rather than general capability metrics. The decisive factor is not always the most advanced aircraft, but the most appropriately applied one. This philosophical shift represented one of the most significant strategic consequences of the A-20's success. The American air war effort had begun with an emphasis on heavy bombers and strategic bombing, the destruction of enemy industrial capacity. The A-20's achievements demonstrated that tactical air power, precisely applied, could have equally decisive results. The broader strategic consequences extended far beyond doctrinal changes. The destruction of Axis supply lines in North Africa directly contributed to the collapse of German and Italian forces in Tunisia in May 1943. Over 250,000 Axis troops were captured, a loss comparable to Stalingrad. Hitler, who had previously ordered Rommel to fight to the last man, was forced to accept a complete defeat. This victory provided Allied forces with a secure base for the invasion of Sicily in July 1943, which in turn led to the Italian campaign and Italy's surrender in September. The entire southern flank of Hitler's fortress Europe had been compromised, forcing the Germans to divert precious resources away from other fronts. For American industry, the A-20's success validated the production philosophy that would ultimately overwhelm the Axis powers. Rather than pursuing the most technologically advanced aircraft possible, American manufacturers focused on designs that balanced performance with ease of production and maintenance. The result was a torrent of aircraft that the Axis could not match in either quality or quantity. By mid-1943, the Douglas plants were producing an A-20 every 3 hours, a rate German industry could not approach even for their simplest aircraft. American factories delivered 7,748 A-20s during the war, while Germany produced only 1,839 of its roughly equivalent Junkers 88 twin-engine bomber. This disparity represented more than just industrial capacity. It reflected fundamentally different approaches to warfare. German aircraft design emphasized technical sophistication and theoretical performance advantages, often at the expense of reliability and ease of production. American design philosophy, exemplified by the A-20, prioritized robustness, maintainability, and suitability for mass production. The consequences of these divergent approaches became increasingly apparent as the war progressed. By early 1944, the Luftwaffe was losing aircraft faster than they could be replaced, while American production continued to accelerate. German pilots, flying increasingly complex aircraft with minimal training due to fuel shortages, faced American pilots with extensive training in robust, forgiving aircraft available in overwhelming numbers. Colonel Wilson, whose innovative employment of the A-20 had demonstrated its potential, was promoted to brigadier general in April 1943 and assigned to develop specialized night attack units across all theaters. His assessment of the strategic impact was characteristically direct. The A-20 showed us that the right tool used correctly is more valuable than the perfect tool used conventionally. We had been measuring aircraft by the wrong metrics: maximum speed, maximum bomb load, maximum range. What mattered more was suitability for specific missions, reliability under combat conditions, and availability in sufficient numbers. Perhaps the most significant strategic consequence was how the A-20 experience influenced post-war American military procurement. The principles demonstrated: balanced design, ease of maintenance, suitability for specific mission profiles, would shape American aircraft development for decades to come. General Curtis LeMay, who would later head Strategic Air Command, observed in 1949, "The lesson of the A-20 is that effectiveness is not determined by any single performance metric, but by the integration of all capabilities into a system optimized for its mission." This principle guided the development of our strategic bomber force. The A-20 also represented an early example of effective technology transfer between allies. The British and Commonwealth forces had initially employed the aircraft under the designation Boston, primarily in daylight operations. The American innovation of systematic night attacks was quickly adopted by RAF squadrons, who then contributed their own tactical refinements. This cross-pollination of ideas enhanced Allied effectiveness throughout the war. For the Soviet Union, which received over 3,000 A-20s through Lend-Lease, the aircraft provided crucial capabilities at a time when their own aircraft industry was still recovering from its westward relocation. Soviet pilots, initially skeptical of the American design, became enthusiastic converts after experiencing its ruggedness in the harsh conditions of the Eastern Front. Marshal Alexander Novikov, commander of the Soviet Air Forces, noted in his memoirs, "The A-20 demonstrated American industrial power more effectively than political statements ever could. That they could produce such aircraft in such numbers and then give them away to Allies made clear the fundamental production disparity between the Axis and Allied powers." By late 1943, the strategic consequences had become self-reinforcing. Each successful A-20 operation further degraded Axis logistics, making it harder to defend against subsequent attacks. This downward spiral of capability eventually rendered organized resistance impossible. Major General James Doolittle, commanding the 12th Air Force in the Mediterranean, summarized the strategic impact. The A-20's contribution wasn't just in destroying enemy supplies, but in forcing fundamental changes in enemy behavior. Once the Germans lost the ability to move at night, they lost operational flexibility. Once they lost flexibility, defeat was inevitable. Epilogue, April 4, 1945. Douglas Aircraft Company, Santa Monica, California. Edward Heinemann, the chief engineer who had designed the DB-7 that evolved into the A-20, stood watching the final production example roll off the assembly line. After 7,748 aircraft, production was ending to make way for newer designs. Yet the legacy of the aircraft that German intelligence had once dismissed as unremarkable was now secure. "We never designed it to be exceptional in any single aspect," Heinemann later recalled. "We designed it to be good at everything it needed to do, simple to build, and easy to maintain. The pilots who flew it into combat transformed it from a good aircraft into a great one by finding the perfect role for its capabilities." The A-20 story encapsulated broader themes of America's contribution to World War II. An industrial base converted from civilian to military production with breathtaking speed. Design philosophies that emphasized practicality over theoretical performance. Tactical innovation that maximized the effectiveness of available equipment. And production capacity that simply overwhelmed the enemy's ability to respond. For the men who flew the A-20 on those dark nights over North Africa, the aircraft represented something more personal. Captain James Mahoney, who led the first night attack mission, expressed it best in a reunion speech in 1978. "She wasn't the fastest. She wasn't the most heavily armed. She didn't have the longest range or the biggest bomb load. But she took us into hell and brought us back, night after night. When we were hit, she kept flying. When we were exhausted, she forgave our mistakes." The Germans might have underestimated the A-20, but those of us who flew her never did. The transformation of the A-20 from an underestimated light bomber to one of the most feared night attackers of World War II offers enduring lessons about the nature of technological advantage in warfare. It is not always the most advanced weapon that proves decisive, but rather the weapon most appropriately employed, available in sufficient numbers, and suited to its specific strategic context. As military technology has grown increasingly sophisticated in the decades since World War II, the fundamental insight demonstrated by the A-20 remains valid. Effectiveness in warfare comes not from technical specifications alone, but from the integration of technology, tactics, training, and industrial capacity. The Germans, with their emphasis on technical sophistication, failed to appreciate the threat posed by an aircraft that excelled not in any single performance metric, but in its balanced capabilities and suitability for mass production. By the time they recognized their error, the night skies over North Africa had already been lost. Today, few A-20s remain intact, preserved in museums as increasingly rare examples of a transformative aircraft. Yet their impact echoes through military aviation history, a reminder that, in warfare, as in so much else, it is dangerous to underestimate the seemingly unremarkable. For the supply convoys of the Africa Corps, moving through what they believed was the safety of desert darkness, that lesson came too late. The A-20 Havocs, dismissed by German intelligence as mediocre bombers of limited threat, descended upon them with devastating effect, transforming the strategic